Right. Thank you very much for everyone attending. This is a Beicio Cymru Coaches Corner call. This is the topic in question is nutrition for cyclists, and we're grateful to have Olivia Barnes along with us today from Sport Wales, who works closely with our academy, well, Beicio Cymru Academy riders and the coaches there. Is that right, Olivia?
Yeah,
Um, I'm literally going to hand over to her now because I'm a mumbling mess for some reason, and let her carry on. Over to you, Olivia.
amazing. Thanks, Mark. Um, could you go on to the next slide, please? So I just wanted to cover a little bit about my background. I studied undergrad in nutrition, mostly around nutrition for health. And then I went on to study my master's in sports nutrition. And then, in terms of my experience, I spent the first few years out of uni working in the NHS, supporting dietitians in the hospital, and then moved on to working alongside psychologists in weight management. And once I kind of like started getting into sport, I did a lot of freelance work, worked with a women's Premier League wheelchair basketball team, and then started working at Sport Wales just over 18 months ago, I think. And my role there is quite varied, but I guess like the main kind of sports and individuals I work with are in cycling, football, golf, athletics, wheelchair basketball, and bobsleigh. Um, Next slide, please, Mark. And I guess like what I just want to set the scene with the slides I've got. So one of the big things I feel I come across is kind of challenging or like tackling where maybe public health messages don't always align with fueling developing riders or just riders in general. So I've just highlighted a couple of key public health messages that sometimes don't align with performance nutrition. So, for example, basing your meals on a higher fiber, starchy carbohydrate is something that's talked about a lot in public health messaging. But for example, with riders, it might be easier to eat lower fiber carbohydrates around races and training because they're easier to digest. So, an example of that would be brown rice versus white rice. Um, and also things like the 5 a day message, that's something that is on the lower end anyway, because we know, generally speaking, across the general population, people aren't reaching that. But for athletes, their needs are higher. So we would say 7+ per day for athletes. Cut down on sugary foods and drinks. And that's a kind of, I guess, referring to free sugars, which are sugars that are added to food, such as like cereals, sweets, and puddings, or found naturally in foods such as honey, or drinks like fruit juice or smoothies. And I guess where that's not particularly helpful is where maybe those foods and drinks can be helpful for increasing carbohydrate intake or can be used around training. So, like fruit juice and smoothies are a really useful way of getting carbohydrates in and in around training. Same thing here with the use reduced fat dairy products after the age of 2. So that's not always helpful because, for example, developing athletes can use the higher fat dairy products to increase their energy intake if they're growing or trying to develop muscle mass, for example. So, again, like something that doesn't always apply. And then the last one is just around the energy prescription that you might see a lot of the time on packaging or on guidance. And that's very generic, and it might not even cover someone's needs at rest that's active, like a cyclist, for example. So I guess that's just kind of, for me, like setting the scene of why it's so important that nutrition is specific to active people or athletes. Next slide, please, Mark. And then another really big thing for me is making sure that athletes are eating for training, but also enjoyment. Because I think a lot of the time there can be a real focus on food being like just there for a purpose, and we know that food is so much more than that. And I guess one of the key things that we look to do is help athletes to make decisions on what they're eating by recognizing where performance nutrition strategies are useful and where following some of the general healthy eating guidelines can be helpful. For example, like we were just talking before about Coca-Cola and sweets being like something that's quite high in sugar, and that might be something that can be quite useful to fuel performance, but it wouldn't necessarily be something to consume day to day outside of that. But again, kind of like a key message is just ensuring that all food can be enjoyed without unnecessary restriction. And we use this 80-20 rule as a way of kind of helping athletes to understand, like 80% of the time, your diet should look, you're fueling really well, you're eating whole foods and including enough fruit and veg and that kind of thing. But then the other 20% can be enjoying cakes and biscuits and that kind of thing, to ensure that there's no labeling around food, essentially. Next slide, please, Mark. And then just quickly, the last one. So these are just things I think are really important to consider when we're talking about nutrition. So language is really important. And I think just considering the language that people use around food, trying to avoid the use of like positive or negatives, all or nothing approaches, because those things can stick with athletes. So like, for example, it might be that an athlete labels a food like carbohydrates, for example, as being bad. And it's really important that we challenge those beliefs and help them to understand why that might not be helpful. And then judgment, I guess, like people can, as a whole, can feel that their food choices reflect on them. So it's important that we are conscious of that when we're having conversations with people about food. And when I'm saying adding, that's just referring to where there needs to be a bit more of a focus on what can be added and instead of what needs to be taken out. But some barriers. So if you're coming across a lot of yes buts, that's normally a sign that there's a bigger barrier than knowledge alone. And it's really important that you kind of dive into that a bit deeper and help that person to problem solve. And then rigidity. Food is really important to avoid black and white thinking, or using terms like cheat days or healthy days or on a diet or off a diet, because that generally can lead to restriction around food. And we know that all foods can be enjoyed year round, and it's just about balance more than anything. So that's it for the slides.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Yeah, really informative. I'm not no expert, so I'm really interested in actually listening to what you had to say there, and what the questions some of the people here come up with. So before we start the Q&A, I have to shamelessly plug something else. This is how it works. So we do have another call next month as part of the kind of ongoing series. So the next call is on the 16th of June. It's a bit different to maybe some of the other ones. This is understanding coach education. So that call might be for somebody who is thinking about getting into coaching. It could be a new coach who's looking at upskill themselves. It could be an experienced coach who's looking at coaching in other disciplines and how the education system at British Cycling could support them on their journey. So if you're interested in that, we'll send out the links and on socials and what have you, and hopefully you can all attend and find some benefit from that. So I'm literally going to hand over to the room. So how it works, put your hand up, just shout out, or put something in the chat. I do have some questions myself, but I'll see what other people come up with first. Who wants to go first? Nobody. Great. Shall I go first? Richard,
Yeah.
Lizzie's unmuted. Lizzie, you go. You've unmuted.
Oh
Right.
no,
Do you just want to?
I
You
was
go first,
encouraging you to
Lizzie.
go first.
Do you just want to just give us a bit of an introduction of who you are? I just
Oh,
it's
yeah,
quite
okay.
helpful, maybe for the.
Yeah, so I'm Lizzie. I'm the Southwest and West Wales Women and Girls Area Coordinator. Is 4 hours a week. Um, it's a quite a broad area. It covers 6 counties, so I'll kind of do my best to support everyone from like um, grassroots beginners, sometimes elites too. And I think nutrition's really interesting, especially for women. I don't know what it would be like to be a man, but from personal experience, I'm just about, I'll be 40 next year, but in my teens, my period stopped, and I'm just really aware, like being around young girls, how they kind of view themselves, I guess. But that I think we do live in a different era now where we do try really empower young women. I'm always really aware of what I'm qualified to talk about and what I'm not. So I am a qualified coach, but while I find nutrition fascinating, I'm obsessed with the Zoe podcast and the microbiome and all things like that. But yeah, I just wanted to sit in tonight because wow, knowledge. Just stuff changes all the time. I don't think I can't, I feel really awkward about questions because as I'm not qualified, I think my main concern would be how I could just encourage and redirect young girls to get correct advice because there's so much information out there.
Yeah, it's a good point. I think you've got. I think it's really important that you think about, I guess, the people that the girls have around them. So, like yourself, for example, I'd really encourage to, if you have relationships with them, to have those conversations. I think it's there's no harm in, I guess, encouraging positive habits or I don't know, being curious and asking questions like, what have you had before a session? Or just even like encouraging to fuel and recover around sessions. I think it doesn't have to be specific, but just that reinforcement of like how important it is, I think is useful. And just being curious, like how are your energy levels if you're noticing someone maybe doesn't seem like they've got that, you know, they're lacking on energy. And if I guess if there's anyone that you're particularly concerned about, referring them to the BDA has quite good resources on nutrition, British Dietetic Association. The sports dietitian, I think it's the Australian one, is quite good as well. But if they need, I guess, one-to-one support, I'm registered with the Sport and Exercise Nutrition Register, which is I guess, attached to the British Dietetic Association, and they have a list of nutritionists on there that
Yeah.
would be able to provide support on a one-to-one basis. But yeah, I don't think there's any harm in, and I guess like encouraging and supporting with nutrition. If you're not qualified, it's just, I guess, identifying if there's a problem and yeah, if you're noticing like low energy levels, I guess starting those conversations.
Yeah, I think this is quite overwhelming, how much paddy diets, and I think
Mm.
it's so hard to kind of filter through all the do's and the don'ts really. But I am aware of like some schoolgirls just skipping lunch, And I always just emphasize if I'm ever in a position where that happens in work, I'm useless in the evenings. I've got I'm not used to anything or anybody. So yeah, I think it's just yeah, I really appreciate what you said. So.
Great. Great. Yeah. Thank you very much, Lizzie, for sharing that. That was. Oh, we got somebody else waiting in the room. There we are. Let's add them in. So yeah, fantastic. Yeah, thanks for that. Really good question to kick off, I think. Really topical as well. I'm going to ask my question now. Okay, so we're speaking Lizzie was specific about women and girls. One thing I'm kind of always conscious of is, young people are on their phones, they're looking at Instagram, TikTok, and things like that, and there's a million and one things on there. I get them on my feed. I think, they just whatever your interests are. If you're into sports and things, it kind of automatically kind of generates like influencers and things who you be might have something in common with. How do we tackle that, the young person's mind, and how easy they are to be influenced around like certain diets and things. You've given some information about a website where it would be really good to go to. I can't imagine it's really interesting for a teenager to go and look at the British Dietitian Association's website. So what are we saying? What message are we passing to coaches to the young people around what they see online? Some of it might be good. Some of it is probably fueled by cash and sponsorship. So eat my energy bar because it's the best one, and I get paid for telling you that. What's the message?
Yeah, good question, and something that comes up quite a lot. And I guess one of the things I've done before is actually looked at social media when I'm working with younger athletes and asked them to think about the stuff that they're seeing online, and some of the stuff that comes up is like what I eat in a day videos. And I always kind of encourage taking those videos with a pinch of salt, I guess. So even if, like, let's say, for example, it's a cyclist that's done a what I eat in a day video. Looking at that video, is it something that's sponsored? Is it a true representation of like what their day looks like? But also that is just one day. And I guess like that's something really important for them to understand when they're looking at things online, is that it's often just such a small snapshot of that person's day, week, month. And I guess the other thing is that nutrition is so individual that what that person's doing isn't necessarily going to work for you. So I guess the message is like some stuff can be useful, but I guess avoiding things that are like, this food is bad for you and you shouldn't include it, or like, I guess that really like black and white thinking. And if someone is selling that, or they're being quite like they're saying things that sound quite out there, like, oh, this bar's gonna, I don't know, fuel you for hours or something like that. I guess taking those messages and like really considering how realistic that is. And a lot of the time that particularly on like Instagram, posts can be sponsored, so is that person getting money for saying that? Like, I guess, yeah, there's a few things with social media that can be quite tricky, but
Yeah, 100%. I agree. So it's just that like education piece, and I guess I assume these are the messages you kind of, if you're working with certain athletes, you're working with the young cyclists on the performance pathway at the Beicio Cymru, and you're passing these messages. I guess not everyone has the luxury of having access to your advice, isn't it, on a kind of almost a day-to-day basis. So yeah, that's the kind of the message. So yeah, thank you very much, Olivia. Thank you. Next question. Does anyone have anything to ask?
Yeah, I got one.
Go on, Rich.
Obviously, I coach a lot of young cyclists, some I know 11 to 16-year-olds, and some of the sessions quite long. We may go on road rides. So they've got to fuel either during a session or between sessions or whatever. And there always seems to be a fascination with gels. Everybody wants gels and whatever. I always try to encourage them, unless you're racing, just eat like natural food. I just wonder what your thoughts were on that, and
Yeah, good question. I think so. There's a couple of things with that. Like, I would be very much the same in that gels can be quite expensive in comparison to other things that you can get the same amount of carbs from. But also, I guess some people don't have the best response to gels from a gut perspective. So yeah, from an expense perspective, there are definitely more cost-effective options. The only thing with that is if they are going to use gels in competition, they do need to trial them. So like practicing them around like a race-specific session. But yeah, as you said, like just generally in training, there are lots of other things and food that you can use that are cheaper and probably tastier.
yeah. Okay.
So Olivia, then on what Richard asked, what would you recommend as an alternative, a cheaper alternative to a supermarket? You can buy them in all the supermarkets now, where they're in the kind of the health nutrition section, aren't they? Where all the protein shakes are and things. You can buy gels, where I've used. What would you advise?
So there's loads of different things you can do. So like bananas are always a good one. Like squares bars, like the saurine loaf, hot cross buns. Like there's loads of different things. Like all sorts of cereal bars can be useful as long as they're easy to unwrap, I guess. And then you can also like make your own like flapjacks or like energy balls. Those are quite easy to make. Can be something as simple as like white bread with jam. Like it doesn't need to be complicated. But yeah, so it certainly doesn't have to be gels either. So just I guess depends on how easy it is for them to unwrap the stuff. But yeah, I guess if you're using gels anyway, like unwrapping a cereal bar is not going to be that much different. So
okay,
great. Anything else, Richard?
No, I say thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Anyway, next question. And we've had some others join as well.
I've got a question.
Yeah, Anna.
I'm not a coach. I'm a parent of two cyclists. My son is 16, 6'2", and trying to fuel him is nigh on impossible. So it's trying to fill him up, sort of like pre-rides, during rides, and after rides. When he's burnt, close on 7,000 calories, trying to fill him back up is quite difficult. What kind of advice of food, really? I mean, he eats very well, but yeah, the advice on just what to give him later on in the evenings, before rides, etc. Really.
Well, Anna, out of curiosity, just before Olivia, what kind of discipline does your son do?
Track and road mainly. So he's coached by Rich there.
Oh, good, yeah, great.
Yeah.
So yeah, cool. Over to you, Olivia.
Yeah, so I guess one thing to consider there is like the energy density of the food that he's having. So like, let's say for example, let's say like he's having porridge, for example. One way that you can increase the energy density of that and potentially like help him feel fuller for longer would be to add things like nut butters, so like peanut butter or like nuts and seeds. Adding things like honey and fruit is obviously going to increase the carbohydrate in that meal. So I guess it's like what I was saying before about like what can you add to things to not necessarily change the meal altogether, but like adding things on top of it. It could be like maybe so one of the things I would suggest is 2 to 4 hours before a session having a meal, but then 1 to 2 hours before having a snack. And then afterwards would be within like 30 minutes of finishing, having a like recovery snack. So that could be like a 500 ml bottle of Yazoo, for example, like a chocolate milk, and then having a meal within 2 hours. I guess one of the things that you can do to increase his intake would be to just like adjust the portion of carbs on his plate. So particularly if he's doing a lot of training, about half of his plate should be carbohydrates. But yeah, adding things to meals is one way to do it. And the other thing is, if he's growing still, what I was saying before about the dairy products, like use full fat milk and yogurts and that kind of thing. Just trying to think of other things that you can do. I guess it's just adding snacks in as well. Yeah, obviously you can increase portions as much as you can, but snacks is another way to do it. What does his what does it look like at the moment?
I'm trying to think, really. They've got quite a good diet. They eat a lot of like quinoa and vegetables. They're fruit. They're good eaters. I've got two, so I've got a daughter as well. But they are good eaters. He does have a dairy allergy, so it's like it's that after kind of race fuel, really, because you see it, others having milkshakes. He can't have that. So he's finding that quick fix after racing and things as well to get the protein in. But I mean, eats flapjacks. There's loads of those kind of things, like where you were saying saurine, get through quite a bit of, and they eat sort of like oat bars. We only tend to use gels for like racing, so he doesn't have many of those. Because yes, it does affect his stomach as well, which, like you said, they're not great in that kind of, and the sugar content. I worry about teeth and. But he finds it some days. He's just come down now and he said, I'm starving. And there's no training today, but that's probably due to yesterday's training, and this has a knock-on effect, isn't it? But it's high. I would have thought it's hard enough to fuel a 16-year-old at 6'2" anyway, let alone with the amount of training that they do.
No, exactly. I mean, adding things in between meals is like so I guess the other thing is eating every 2 to 4 hours. So particularly if he's coming to you a lot and saying, oh, I'm hungry all the time, it might be that he needs to eat a bit more regularly. And that doesn't necessarily have to be like a full meal. It could be something like a smoothie where you're chucking in things like the nut butters and those extras that can really help with filling up. Does he, so you said he's got a dairy allergy, does he have other does he have an alternative like soya milk or anything like that?
So he can have lactose-free milk, we're right on that, and he can have cheese. Yogurts, he's not keen on the lactose-free yogurts or anything. So but yeah.
I think Alpro do so if you're saying about like the milkshakes, I think Alpro do a portable like UHT milkshake. That would be, I think, soya milk, but I guess if he, I don't think there's a lactose-free version of that. So, but whether that's worth a try from a recovery perspective. It is tricky, and that's something that comes up quite a lot, is just like almost filling 16-year-olds up that are training as well. It is difficult, so it's just finding those little ways to add extra stuff in, I guess.
All right, brilliant, thank you.
Okay, so off the bat, so my other question might lead up, sorry if anyone else wants to ask something, is relevant. So I before the call started, I was chatting to Olivia, and I obviously am not going to name brands. There's a number of them out there, but there's this particular brand that keeps on kind of up on my social feeds, aimed at teenagers, and use a bit of snippet. So yeah, essentially is a shake, but it's I've got it up here. Nutritionally rich food powder developed for active children. So if it comes in a shake form, I think you add water to it and as a powder essentially. What's your views on these meal shake things? Not necessarily protein shakes, but meal shakes. Would that be something you would advise?
So first off, from a supplement perspective, anyway, it would need to be Informed Sport. So for anyone that doesn't know, Informed Sport is it's a batch testing company. So essentially, all supplements are not risk free, but I guess the idea of the batch testing is to attest to ensure that those supplements don't have banned substances in them from a athlete perspective. But again, there's no guarantee with that. So we always say any supplement, make sure it's Informed Sport, just from a, I guess, limiting risk perspective.
Yeah. So I've just checked, and it is on their website.
Fab. So the next thing that you'd want to be considering is what the benefit is, and whether it's whether it's evidence based. Like, there's a few questions that you need to consider, and it always comes down to whether you can achieve the same thing through food or not. My thing with even meal replacement shakes is you're often missing out on other things like fiber, for example, and potentially like not feeling the benefits of having an actual meal. Where meal replacement shakes or recovery shakes, for example, can be helpful is from a convenience perspective, or like let's say, for example, traveling, not necessarily even outside of the UK, but particularly when traveling abroad, where maybe, you know, likes and dislikes come into play a bit more, and maybe like local cuisines don't suit the person very well, or the foods aren't familiar to them. Like, those kinds of shakes can be quite helpful on a short-term basis, where you know that they're not getting what they need through food and diet alone. But from a day-to-day perspective, we know that you can get, for most people, everything that you need from food. So I guess it's context dependent, really. With younger athletes, it's quite tricky because it's whether they fully understand the why and the benefit of the supplement as well. But yeah, I guess like protein shakes and recovery shakes are quite well researched. It's just whether it's needed, really, I guess.
Yeah, so yeah, it's maybe on a case by case basis. But I was thinking more of what Anna was saying. Really, is if getting them calories in would you look at doing? Maybe he probably is by the sounds of things. But I was going to say exactly what she said about I guess most teenage boys who are 6'2", not just cyclists, they love eating food, and I do. I'm a bit older than 16 though, so. Yeah, cool. Yeah, is that Anna? Is that something that you do, or you've looked at the like meal replacement, but it's maybe a bit quicker to digest as well?
No, we tend to use sort of, like, I suppose, for want of a better word, real food rather than
Great.
replacements, really. So just
good.
better for, well, they're only little, aren't they, at the end of the day?
Yeah, of course.
Which is not little, but yeah.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, cool. Yeah, I just want something I was wondering. Yeah, great. On to the next one then, guys. Anyone else? Somebody's got a question, surely. Put it in the chat if you like. Lizzie's camera's just come off. She must have another question. Otherwise, that's it. We'll leave, and then we are go.
Yeah. No, I didn't have another question, so I really enjoyed listening to it.
Okay, no worries. Right, so yeah, we have got a few other people. So is there anything else you want to ask Olivia? Now we've got here. I'm absolutely fine to to leave and do. Is there any like closing remarks, Olivia, that you kind of just to bring it all together? You know what? So we obviously we focused mainly on. So we had questions around women and girls. Lizzie kind of brought up and the really good advice that you gave around just preaching and asking questions really and signposting. Um, Working with young athletes, obviously Richard is one of the coaches and a parent asking a question. So what about we're not all performance nutrition is related to young athletes. What about somebody older? I know the demographic generally is for cyclists is older. What kind of day-to-day kind of nutrition would you be advising a club cyclist? I know with keeping themselves healthy because it is strenuous riding a bike. I know I was out on the weekend trying to be a cyclist. So what advice would you give to people my age in their 40s?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the advice doesn't change that much in terms of, regular meals and snacks is really important to ensure that you're fueling well. And even just from a recovery perspective, what the next day is equally as important to ensure that you're recovering well. So I guess some key things to consider from like a on bike perspective is just like really ensuring that the carbohydrate intake is adjusted depending on the duration and intensity. So like for a general rule of thumb, rides around an hour should be about 30 grams an hour. When you're going to like above 2 hours, it's normally around 60, and then anything above that is 90 grams and beyond. But the intensity matters. So let's say, for example, you're doing an endurance ride that's a bit over 2 hours. If it's an easy like recovery ride, 30 to 60 grams might be enough, depending on like how much you can tolerate and your preferences. But if there's a ride with efforts or climbs, the requirement is higher. So like 90 grams an hour might be more appropriate. And it's just considering where you're fueling as well as important. So like not delaying fueling until you feel the need. And also like using, let's say, for example, it's a ride with efforts, like using the time before the effort to fuel, and that kind of thing, I guess. So I guess on bike nutrition is super important so that you're getting the most out of the session. So you're not fueling to avoid like the bonk or the hitting the wall. You're fueling to get what you can out of the session and like adapt from the training.
Great. All right. I did have one last question that I didn't write down. So I was at a BMX race on the weekend as marshalling and supporting. So obviously high intensity for, riders of going at doing 4 races throughout the day, 40 seconds long. Similar maybe to a track event. Somebody's generally somewhere at a velodrome all day, aren't they? A sprinter would do a number of short efforts, super high intensity. Then there's a lull in between. At these events, great for the spectators. Hot dogs, burgers, sweets, sugary drinks, everything. So there was like 250 young riders, lots of Welsh ones there because it was a Welsh local race. What advice are we giving to the parents of somebody at one of them kinds of events? What am I eating during the day? Because I'm not burning an awful lot of calories, but I'd certainly need to eat throughout the day and perform my best for 40 seconds every hour.
Yeah, so BMX isn't one that I've worked with before, but I guess just applying what I would say from a track sprint perspective is like, again, like the intensity is obviously super important, and the amount of times in that day that they're racing obviously plays a part in how much they need, but also just like your day-to-day requirements as a human. So like we know that like the general messaging is like 3 meals a day, and like breakfast, lunch, dinner, with potentially with snacks in between. But for an active individual or an athlete, that kind of messaging might not be helpful. So like adjusting meal times and not seeing meals in that kind of typical format is important. And also considering, I guess, the timings between races. So like if you've got a really short period between to recover, like just focusing on really simple carbohydrates, like sugars essentially, so like sweets. So that might be with, if you've got half an hour between races. If you've got a little bit longer, like 1 to 2 hours, that's where like cereal bars, bananas, like the hot cross buns, those kinds of things that take a little bit longer to digest can be useful. And then when you've got longer, so like a 3 to 4 hour window between, that's where you can have a full meal with protein and potentially some vegetables or fruit there as well. But keeping like a low fiber content is important. So like utilizing like white rice, white pasta, that kind of thing from a digestion perspective. Yeah, I guess the message is like, even if it's short events, it's important to eat well throughout the day and keep yourself fueled as well as possible. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Yeah. It is it's important message, but yeah, like it doesn't really matter the discipline you're doing then, essentially. It's kind of the similar advice. So before we go, are there any other questions from anyone else?
Yeah, I just had one question. With recommendations on like additional like vitamin tablets, some like I've read like some science says that we should be consuming that within the food we're consuming on a daily basis. But are there any like supplements that you think athletes like cyclists should be taking regularly? Like should we be consuming that within our food, or are there certain foods that you, like supplements you think we should be taking or recommend?
Yeah, good question. So I guess one that's super important to consider is vitamin D. So between the months of October and March, we don't get enough through sun. So normally we get our vitamin D through sunlight exposure. But between the months of October and March in the UK, we don't get enough of that essentially. So between those months, everyone in the UK should be taking a vitamin D supplement. But for athletes, it might be that they need to take that. They have higher needs, but it might also be that they need to take that year round, depending on what their day-to-day looks like. So for like a track sprinter, for example, most of their training is indoors. So it might be that actually they need to take that supplement year round. The other one that might be worth considering is omega-3 if they don't like oily fish or things like chia seeds. So that's another one that could be something to consider. The vitamin D is kind of everyone should be doing. The omega-3 is kind of depending on whether they're getting that through their diet. And then I guess another one might be something like iron if iron levels are low, but hopefully that's being addressed from a GP perspective, addressed through a GP perspective. So I guess there's only really like one that's a must have, and then everything else is kind of dependent on like the individual.
Okay, thanks for that, Olivia.
Oh, the other thing might be, so sorry. The other thing is if you've got cold symptoms, vitamin C and zinc can help to reduce the severity of those symptoms and reduce how long you're ill for. So that's another thing, like if you're unwell, vitamin C and zinc is something to take.
So are we talking through supplements, or vitamin C is a big one in school when I was a kid? Eat these kinds of fruits. Would you advise the fruits first, or like the pills I can buy from the shop?
So when you're unwell, so I wouldn't say take vitamin C and zinc all the time, but when you're unwell, having the supplement form is almost like the most effective way because you're getting the best dose that way. Obviously, you can take things on from a food perspective, but the supplements are like the most effective form, I guess.
Okay, so I'm going another question now, unless anyone else has. So, energy drinks, not the isotonic, not like the Lucozade Sport. I don't want to brand not that. I know that's not necessarily an energy drink per se, but the big brand ones, the ones who wear the helmets with the main, so like Red Bulls and Monsters and things like that. They have definitely something that's marketed at sports.
Mm-hmm.
I think we might have covered it maybe with Coca-Cola, but they maybe what's your views on those then? Obviously linked to sports heavily.
Yeah, so caffeine in general is a really well-researched supplement. So we know that it can be beneficial for a number of things like concentration, reaction time, perception of like how tired you are. But I guess the difficulty with things like carbonated caffeinated drinks like Red Bull, Monster and that kind of thing, they're not informed sport, so it's a bit of a grey area, but also they the way that they are means that is a higher chance of like gut distress and discomfort compared to say like a tailored caffeine supplement from like SIS, for example, where it's really, I guess, been formed in a way to reduce that. The other thing is that a lot of the time people take those thinking that it's going to give them energy, and we know that caffeine doesn't actually give you any energy. It's just maybe having an effect on how energized you feel. And from a young athlete perspective, for example, my general rule of thumb is no, like you don't need it. It's not like carbohydrates where you need carbohydrates to fuel well and perform well. But it is something that's happening, I guess, even in those younger age groups. So I generally would say those ones are quite high in caffeine, and the recommended like dose of caffeine is 1 to 3 milligrams per kilo of body weight. So for someone that's younger, that might be above that kind of recommendation, and we know that beyond that you're not getting any performance benefits, but also it might be that you start to have negative side effects from that, like heart palpitations and that kind of thing. So it's really tricky, and it can also have an impact on sleep. So yeah, it's a really difficult one to navigate, particularly with younger riders where maybe their understanding and ability to make decisions around those kinds of things is not the same as an adult. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, 100%. I think it does. So yeah, it's just an important part of young people's lives, isn't it? I think they're the brands that they are interested in the same as we could go off topic and about vapes and tobacco and how that has effects on the or whatever the vaping pens and things which young people seem to be really interested in now. But there's always going to be trends and different things that come out. So it's just in perspective. What's his views on vaping? Yeah, I will cover that as the closing question on SNR. Vaping in performance athletes. Well, what's your views on that? So I'm assuming the ones with the kind of nicotine in as well. How does that have an effect on a young person's body and performance?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't. It's the same with caffeine, where there's not really going to be enough research to know what effect it's having. I guess the difficulty with things like nicotine is the impact that it's potentially having on like appetite, for example, and how it might affect someone's ability to know when they're hungry and that kind of thing. We know it's an appetite suppressant. The other thing is that's quite popular nowadays is the little pouches that have nicotine in them that people put under their gums.
Snuffs, I think that's called, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. So we know that there's, that's not great for gum health and those kinds of things. So it's difficult because we know that that's what young people are exposed to. But we know that it has, negative health consequences. So yeah, the only thing that we can do is just guide them with that and give them the information. But from we just, I guess we know that from a decision making perspective, young people might struggle with that and are easily influenced. So I don't think that we can necessarily stop it from happening, but being that giving that guidance and support around that is important.
Great, yeah, yeah. I think that's just something that not all young people, but there's a lot of young people in cycling, and a lot of the coaching kind of direction is most people coach young people. I think for the most part, I know there's elements in other clubs, but our clubs generally are who coach young people. So these might be problems that they will come across. So yeah, that's some good advice and information that they could maybe pass on. Any other questions before we go? We've been a good hour, to be fair. Richard?
No, that's very good. Thanks.
Yeah, great. No worries. Thank you, Richard. Anyone else? I think we're done. No, let's just check the chat room just in case. There's no messages in there. So thank you so much, Olivia, and everyone for attending. I'm going to end the recording now and press stop.